Acid Bath are a band that have somehow morphed from relative obscurity in the 90s, primarily playing shows to a dedicated cult following within Louisiana, to perhaps one of the most celebrated and talked about metal acts within the modern day, selling out multiple large shows and perhaps being the most hyped act at festivals that feature countless artists that would have dwarfed them in terms of legacy and popularity during their active years. Despite this being a common story for countless bands from that time period, such as Slowdive and Duster, Acid Bath are perhaps one of the most inspiring examples due to the many setbacks they experienced throughout their career and subsequent 27-year hiatus. From a tragic death within the band to a record label that did everything in their power to sabotage their success in the years since their original split, every piece of evidence from the band's history suggests that they shouldn't have the sheer popularity that they are currently experiencing amongst younger generations. And this got me thinking, how have Acid Bath become so popular and celebrated within generations that weren't even alive during the 90s? Surely there is evidence within their history, music, presentation, and the state of modern culture that can explain how they received such success and cultural relevance against all odds. In order to understand why Acid Bath have become so popular in the modern day, we first need to explore the band's history and how that resulted in a sound and perhaps more importantly, visual presentation that sparked the imaginations of metalhead zoomers across the world. Acid Bath would form in 1991 and came into this world as a result of the breakup of two other bands, specifically the bands Dark Carnival and Golgotha. Golgotha would actually remain the original name for the band before they quickly realised the name was already being utilised by a band within Europe, which resulted in the iconic name Acid Bath. Although many people accredit the name to John Hay, the Acid Bath killer who would become infamous for murdering his victims before throwing them in a literal bath full of acid, various interviews suggest that this actually isn't the case. They have admitted to stealing the name from a local punk band that had broken up a few years before the formation of Acid Bath. They claimed they appreciated the name due to the metric ton of LSD they consumed during that period in their lives. This LSD obsession can be entirely explained by the location in which the band was from, which, spoiler alert, is in the middle of nowhere. Although the band would receive their cult following through the New Orleans sludge scene, they originally formed out of a location that is somehow more redneck and remote, Homer, an area that has been described by the band as completely desolate, no buildings, no life, just drugs and 5 long-haired sludge-obsessed weirdos apparently. When Acid Bath formed, there was already an established New Orleans scene, consisting of bands like I Hate God and Soylent Green. Unfortunately, due to the location of the band, they were seen as outsiders to that specific scene, and had to force themselves into the more built-up New Orleans to build any form of fan base. Whilst in Homer, they would record their first demo, Hymns of the Needle Freak, in 1993, which is primarily lost to time to this day. This demo would perform well enough within their local scene for a sprinkling of label attention, which prompted the band to begin looking. Surprisingly, the band were almost signed by the iconic Roadrunner Records, and despite the label being heavily interested, the representative would quite literally fall asleep during one of their shows, resulting in the deal falling through. To this day, I believe Acid Bath could have been one of the most popular metal bands in the 90s if the Roadrunner Records had actually decided to sign them instead of honk shoeing. Oh well, I'm sure the band has plenty of other options that isn't going to immediately fuck. At this point, the band really only had one option left, which prompted them to sign a contract with Rotten Records, apparently without reading a single line. I'm sure this won't be the biggest mistake of their professional career. Rotten Records would allow for the release of their magnum opus, When the Kite String Pops, in 1994, which upon release would shock fans of the band and locals alike, not just due to the heavy, groundbreaking style of riff and vocals utilised on the album, but the extremely disturbing album cover that would later become iconic and a huge reason for their success. During the production of the album, the 5 members struggled to agree on what to use for the album cover. This prompted Ron Peterson of Rotten Records to pull something out of his bag of tricks. Turns out he knew a guy who was schizophrenically obsessed with serial killers, so much so he would regularly write and visit many of these monsters, including the infamous John Wayne Gacy. Peterson would present the Pogo the Clown artwork drawn by Gacy towards the band, who were initially confused at the sight of the crudely drawn clown. clown, although after learning the backstory of the painting decided to utilize it for the album. If you are somehow unaware, John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer from the 70s that murdered 33 young boys. The artwork was inspired by his day job where he would work as a clown. The decision to use this cover meant they were forced to get in touch with Gacy, who was still alive at the time of the album's creation, which unfortunately also meant they literally had to pay the notorious killer clown to use the artwork on the album, which brings up one of the main criticisms presented towards the band and label. Not only were the band profiting off of serial killers, but had to quite literally pay a serial killer in order to use the art. This obviously received heavy criticism, which led to a statement from the owner of Rotten Records, Ron Peterson. He simply said, "This is America, you should be able to do whatever you want," and to be fair, if profiting off of a serial killer through sludge metal isn't the most American thing feasibly possible, then I don't know what is. Upon release, the album would sell just over 37,000 copies, which is incredibly good for an independent debut album that received no marketing apart from the heinous album cover. 2 years later, the band would release their second and final album, Pagan Terrorism Tactics. This time, the band decided to use artwork from Jack Kevorkian, a proponent of assisted self-deletion and euthanasia, who is said to have assisted 130 patients in self-deletion. He was convicted of murder in 1999, and although he isn't as much of a monster as Gacy, he's still a pretty fucking notorious individual, cementing the album art as disturbing once again. Much like When the Kite String Pops, this wasn't the original choice of artwork from the band and was heavily encouraged by Rotten Records. This was actually the original album cover, a highly edited image of a decapitated animal head. The Kevorkian cover would cause more controversy than the Gacy artwork somehow, this time potentially resulting in financial damage, as the album was forbidden to be sold within Australia for a period of time, which may not sound like much, but what you don't realise is Australian motherfuckers love sludge metal just about as much as they love cigarettes and talking like British people with Down syndrome, so they potentially missed out on a big market there. Although the band hadn't hit the mainstream as of yet, they had truly cemented themselves within the Louisiana underground, even having their artwork branded on hamsters and sold at concerts. Well, that's if you believe the consistent yapping of Theo Von, but I digress. Despite the consistent release of unique music within the scene, this would actually be their final project. You see, by this point in time, the band were beginning to skew creatively. Lead singer Dax Riggs had started writing the more mellow acoustic music he would become known for within his later solo work, and the rest of the band were becoming stressed at the idea of individuals separate from the band relying on them financially. Creative disagreements would actually begin during the creation of Pagan Terrorism Tactics, mainly due to the rest of the band members rejecting many of Riggs's ideas that fit into a more gentle sonic direction, you know, as opposed to screeching over Black Flag My War style riffage. Despite this, they began working on their next album entitled Killer Rat Poison. The name would be inspired by a literal box of rat poison, which I suppose makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, this album would never see release, with no demos or even crude recordings being released to the public. This was unfortunately due to a tragedy that would put an end to the band both creatively and in terms of their live performances. On January 23rd, 1997, bassist Audie Pittrie would become the victim of a car accident, which would unfortunately take the life of Audie and his two parents, with the only survivor being his younger brother Kelly. The crash would be the result of a drunk driver running a stop sign, leading to his arrest and subsequent charge, which involved 3 counts of vehicular manslaughter. The death of Pittrie would become the straw that broke the camel's back for Acid Bath. Dax Riggs would later reveal that Audie was the one person holding the band together at that point in time. Although Acid Bath attempted to play a few shows without Audie, it didn't feel the same. It felt as if the life and soul had left the band. Not only had they lost a section of their creative drive, they had lost a close friend, which led to the members splitting off into various other projects, and that would be the end of the original run of Acid Bath. Despite Acid Bath selling relatively well for an underground, inaccessible band with a record label that refused to put any money into marketing or promotion, they were still a band that relied on their small cult following within the New Orleans scene during their original run. So how in just under 30 years has it gotten to the point where Acid Bath are one of the most discussed and celebrated bands within alternative and underground music, with their current shows not only selling out but seeing a crowd that spans multiple generations? Well, if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'd probably just assume the situation mirrors bands like Slowdive or Duster, where the band slowly picks up steam on the internet due to the prominence of early music messaging boards such as 4chan's Mew, and the ability to freely and easily discuss music through online means, which eventually reaches a boiling point and explodes due to the dystopian virality of TikTok. Although that is kind of the case, it happened in a very different way to the bands previously mentioned, primarily due to how inaccessible Acid Bath's music it was, was, even with the prominence of the internet. Back when I discovered Acid Bath 10 or so years ago, it was incredibly difficult to actually find and listen to their music. Not only was their music missing from streaming services such as Spotify, but the vast majority of YouTube re-uploads were immediately taken down through copyright strikes. In order to actually listen to Acid Bath, you had to go to some dark places, which legitimately led me to literal corn websites to listen to a f***ing sludge metal album. So why is this? Did the band just simply not want their music accessible through online means? Well, no, it was entirely the fault of their label, Rotten Records. So by this point in the video, we're already aware that Rotten CEO Ron Peterson has a, let's say, immoral stance on the usage of shocking album art, but unfortunately it gets so much worse, as Rotten Records have only been a hindrance to the success of the band since their original signing. This can be highlighted by a story relayed by the band in interviews since their original split. After one of the band's later tours in the 90s, they found themselves in a location not too far from Ron Peterson's residence, and due to the fact they had barely discussed record sales or even payment, decided to pay him a visit in order to discuss the success of the tour. When they arrived, they were told by his assistant that Peterson wasn't home, although would be back shortly, meaning the band should wait in his garage. After waiting for a few hours, they were greeted by police officers who accused them of attempting to rob the record label. Apparently, according to the band, Ron Peterson was home the entire time, and instead of confronting the band, he called the police and accused them of robbing his residence, resulting in the band being escorted back to Louisiana. This may seem like an insane thing to do for no logical reason, although it makes perfect sense when you learn about Peterson's supposed habit of underpaying record sales to bands on his label in order to line his pockets. There have been stories floating around of Peterson only paying bands $5,000 out of a supposed $500,000 in sales. The rest of the money he allegedly, of course, just keeps for himself. Despite Peterson's addiction to shekels, he runs Rotten Records like a literal fucking retard, and for decades would refuse to release any of Acid Bath's music on streaming services, even going as far as copyright striking re-uploads to YouTube. This continued through Acid Bath's monumental online growth, with the band even becoming Rotten's most popular product by far by the time the 2010s rolled around. This literally makes zero sense, as not only does it limit the reach of the band massively, but financially damages the record label. But I suppose we cannot expect much from a literal spit dribbler who not only chooses to call their record label Rotten Records, but also is too much of a pussy to confront his own band members without contacting the feds. Despite Rotten Records actively sabotaging the success of Acid Bath, the group would still pick up traction through online means, with the cover for When the Kite String Pops alongside the supposed rarity of the album adding to its cult-like status. Not only did the album cover stick out like a sore thumb on literally any online forum, but the actions of Rotten Records made it incredibly difficult to seek out the music. It seemed like a cursed piece of media that you weren't supposed to listen to, and you know motherfuckers on the internet absolutely eat that shit up. Slowly but surely the album gained traction. It started being featured on mulecore charts, and due to how captivating and shocking the album cover was, it almost cancelled out the negative side effects of Rotten Records. As Acid Bath began to grow online, so did the short form and viral nature of social media. TikTok began heavily influencing online music culture, which once again spread Acid Bath to more eyes and ears. Turns out the greatest clickbait of all time is in fact serial killer artwork, which only became more captivating as these dusty ass hoes became further obsessed with sexualizing serial killers. Despite all the online success, Acid Bath remained relatively silent on their growing attention, and although the band were consistently being offered large sums of money to reunite, even reaching upwards of $80,000 for just one show, nothing would come to fruition for decades. Any rumours of a reunion would always fall through, mainly due to the lead singer Dax Riggs. Riggs didn't want to sing Acid Bath songs for a long period of time. Not only had his style evolved and moved far away from the screeching Acid Bath style of vocals, but the death of Audie Pittrey made the idea of singing for the band again traumatic. The band attempted to find other singers that could potentially replicate Riggs' distinct style, although found it almost impossible to locate anybody who fit the description, primarily due to how unique Dax Riggs is as a singer. They got so desperate at one point that they attempted to hire a Dax Riggs impersonator and video creator they found on YouTube, although the impersonator would refuse as he was simply just a child. Rumours persisted in 2014, with some publications suggesting that Corey Taylor from Slipknot of all people would replace Dax Riggs for the tribute, although these rumours were quickly dismantled. cancelled, with the band members claiming that there is no acid bath without Audie Pitre. This radio silence would shift into deafening white noise in 2024 when the absolute train wreck of a festival that is Sick New World announced their 2025 lineup. Amongst all the nostalgia bait and trendy hardcore bands crowding the lineup, there was just one little surprise. Acid Bath was placed slap bang in the middle of the poster. Yeah, according to Sick New World, Acid Bath would be reuniting to play the festival, with later news confirming that the lineup would include Dax Riggs. So how did this happen? Well, unfortunately, much like their breakup all those years ago, the decision came after another death. Close friend and drummer Tommy Viator had passed away in May 2024, which put things into perspective for the remaining band members. They had continuously thrown around the idea of a tribute or some sort of reuniting show, and the death of another close friend urged them to do it before it may be too late. According to Riggs, it felt completely natural and not painful like in the way it felt after the death of Pitre. Unfortunately, Sick New World was cancelled due to spending way too much money on boomer and Scientologist headliners, but luckily Acid Bath announced various other festival performances alongside headlining shows, most of which immediately sold out, with many of the shows occurring a few weeks prior to the writing of this video. What is surprising about these shows is the demographic. It isn't just 50-year-old sludge heads from the original scene. The venues are swarming with fans of various ages, including a huge population of individuals from generations that weren't even alive during the 90s. The atmosphere has been described by fans as electric, with the passion for the music really presenting itself. The band had gone from playing to 100 people in a dusty New Orleans venue to selling out 4,000 capacity venues all across America. That is quite the jump, especially when you consider the 28 years of inactivity and record label that actively tried to sabotage the success of the band through idiotic business practices. The band has grown exponentially, going from a niche cult band in the 90s to one of the most passionately discussed metal acts period. Although it may be easy to accredit this entirely to the internet, i.e. music boards in the 2010s and then social media like TikTok in the present day, I do believe there is more at play here, and it has a lot to do with the band's history, inherent traits, and the state of our modern culture. Let's first look towards the most eye-catching thing about the band, the album cover for When the Kite String Pops. Although the album cover wasn't the original choice of the band and was heavily encouraged by Rotten Records, I do believe the choice of cover and context behind the artwork is a huge reason as to why the band has kept its cult following for so long, to the point where it's essentially grown into a Gen Z obsession in the modern day. The first reason is obvious. Anyone even slightly aware of John Wayne Gacy or serial killers in general is immediately going to recognize the artwork and will subsequently explore the music within the album out of either morbid curiosity or a lust-fueled fascination, and is highlighted by Gen Z's immeasurable obsession with serial killers in the modern day. I'm sure each and every one of you have either known or, God forbid, dated somebody who is obsessed with binge-watching Netflix serial killer documentaries, and in some cases actually fetishizing these absolute monsters as if they are some storybook sweetheart sex symbol as opposed to an individual that tore apart the lives of countless individuals. There are many reasons as to why this disturbing obsession exists in modern culture and is only getting worse. The first culprit is quite clearly the true crime industry, constantly shitting out slop documentaries where they attempt to explain and humanize these absolute monsters for clicks and watch time. Even worse than that are the dramatized recreations with conventionally attractive actors playing the lead role of the serial killer, and again humanizing the criminals in a way that's far more heinous than just documentaries, through thirst traps. This type of content is extremely popular, specifically amongst women, often shooting to the top of Netflix charts whenever released, and regardless of the intentions of the director, the serial killer always without fail gains large amounts of attention for all the wrong reasons all over social media. Thirst edits, Sigma edits, the Huz trying to explain why fucking Jeffrey Dahmer was misunderstood. When this media is consistently pushed into the frontal lobes of a generation that is already desensitized to violence in a post 9/11 Instagram reel gore age, it's bound to somewhat morph what people are going to find interesting and appealing within media, and more specifically music. So what does this have to do with Acid Bath? Well, it's pretty obvious. Their album cover for When the Kite String Pops features artwork by perhaps the most notorious and recognizable serial killer in history, prompting any disturbed femcel gooner to immediately listen to the contents of the project. And although John Wayne Gacy is rarely sexualized because, you know, he's disgusting to look at and people literally only ever care about looks, the obsession runs deeper than just a baseline attraction. This then inherently links itself to the actual contents of the music, specifically the lyrical content within the first two albums. Oftentimes when you are presented with a project or song from the overarching genre of metal, 6 times out of 10 you are subject to the most over-the-top, theatrical and overly edgy lyricism, especially if you're exploring projects before the turn of the millennium. Despite Acid Bath's edgy presentation and album covers, their lyrical content avoids the exaggerated edge that plagues much of metal and instead creates dark imagery that's realistic and disturbing, especially if you consider the band are from a shithole in the middle of nowhere. It's a style of lyricism that was truly a product of their location. Based on everything I've read, southern Louisiana seems like an absolute shithole and apparently was much worse in the 90s. Violent crime and drug use was rampant, with the band themselves also consistently partaking in psychedelic use, from magic mushrooms they'd find in cow dung to literal hat man summoning deliriants. The area is also heavily religious, so didn't take too kindly to a group of drugged up metalheads. This resulted in the vast majority of the band's earliest fans fitting into just a few key demographics: edgelords, criminals, drug addicts, or most commonly all three at the same time. We can even look past their most iconic project and towards their second album, Pagan Terrorism Tactics, when exploring the way in which the lyricism and style appeals to a more modern audience. Many of the songs on the album were directly inspired by the band's many drug experiences. Pagan Love Song, for example, references a period where the band would take a deliriant named Angel's Trumpets. So if you're unaware of what a deliriant does to you, it isn't from peace and love like most psychedelics. It's cockroaches, bugs under your skin, and consistent visits from unearthly demons. This experience inspired lyrics such as Eating Dead Flowers, Bleeding in a Strange Daze, which remains edgy and true to the style of metal whilst being somewhat poetic and less forced than the vast majority of edge that's seen on other metal projects, even from contemporaries like in the case of I Hate God. Many of their lyrics reflect real life events, the type of events that you would hear Theo Von spout out on his podcast. Real horrific situations such as the idea of murdering your parents on LSD, something that's equally as horrific as the over-the-top works of, for example, Cannibal Corpse, but more approachable and intriguing for a generation that will always prefer real events that reflect horror to something crafted in fiction and created purely for shock value. There's a reason younger generations prefer lost media video essays or true crime documentaries to over-the-top horror films in the modern day. We have built a fascination for the dark and disturbed, and that fascination only builds when it's based entirely in reality. Another thing we can point towards is the explosion in popularity of metal's subgenres that stray more towards alternative sensibilities. This can easily be seen with the nu metal explosion, and although this was almost entirely due to the visual aspects of the subgenre, it allowed for bands within other heavier subgenres of music to also gain large amounts of popularity online. All you need is an appealing image, piece of artwork, or anything that can immediately engage an ADHD-riddled zoomer visually, and thanks to the one good thing Rotten Records did for the success of the band, Acid Bath have reaped the rewards of a culture that is increasingly accepting of much heavier music. Through their short time creating music, Acid Bath were essentially able to create the blueprint for sludge metal within the modern day. Although Black Flag's My War alongside bands like Melvin's heavily influenced the style of the New Orleans scene, I don't think there is a band that influences the modern sound and sensibilities quite like Acid Bath. Many of you sludge heads may currently be screaming at your monitor something along the lines of most modern sludge sounds nothing like Acid Bath and actually strays more towards the atmospheric sludge direction, but that ignores perhaps the biggest trend within new alternative music: the combination of heavy styles, techniques and genres to create things that sometimes are really good and other times just meld into distorted Play-Doh slop perfect for the ears of people like this. When it comes to bands within the sludge metal genre, nobody combines styles quite like Acid Bath. Their combination of hardcore punk, death, stoner, grind, even aspects of the earliest within the emo-core subgenres through vocals. It creates a sound modern bands can pick from that is already sonically dense in terms of its inspiration and genre conventions. It's clear that anyone inspired by Acid Bath is very likely going to create music that is at the very least appealing, as we can even look outside of the genre of sludge when exploring bands Acid Bath have influenced. For example, Slipknot, Deftones, Lamb of God, and even Meshuggah, with each of these bands having sizable zoomerish audiences within the modern day. If we can say anything about Acid Bath, they are a band for the riff heads. Chunky, smooth-brained motherfuckers that just want to hear dark, distorted riffs. And it just so turns out that is a huge section of the modern metal audience. And although modern metal seems to be continuously harassed by overly technical bands, absolute abortions like Sleep Token, and slam metal that somehow incorporates dubstep, the success of Acid Bath in the modern day proves that there is home for purely sludgy heavy riffs within modern music. And as somebody who started off my metal journey on this channel with a video about Acid Bath, I couldn't be happier to see their overwhelming success, regardless of whether it's due to the completely cooked nature of culture within the modern day.